The following is a conversation with Ken Pucker. Ken is an advisory director to Berkshire Partners, currently teaching sustainability at the Boston University Questrom School of Business, and among many other things, Ken formerly served as Chief Operating Officer at Timberland. In this conversation, Ken and I speak about two distinctly defined chapters. The first is me trying to understand what ESG is, and then the second is us speaking about Ken's viral article which pulled the sheets back on the myth of sustainable fashion, something which I think a lot of us instinctually know and understand, but conveniently ignore. So in this podcast, you can expect to hear about the following: the thankless job and infinite complexity of trying to price in externalities. This is particularly in reference to ESG, but as well applicable to the myth of sustainable fashion. What is ESG and why is it potentially changing the future of capitalism? The irony-laden myth of sustainable fashion, why recycling isn't all it's made up to be. There are some hard truths in there about overconsumption. So do hang around to the end to hear my afterthoughts from the chat. But then, with no further ado, here is magnificent Ken Pucker. Mr. Ken Pucker, thank you so much for joining me, mate.
My pleasure.
So, as we were sort of briefly discussing off air, I wanted to sort of break up the conversation into two distinct parts, and that was introducing ESG and then finally finishing with the myth of a sustainable fashion. So, to start off, I loved this quote in one of the most recent articles you published that isn't your quote, but nonetheless you repurposed it. ESG investing defined as diverse, growing, and hard to categorize. So could you make sense of that, please?
I'd love to tell you I could make sense of it. The rhetoric is way ahead of the reality on ESG investing. The intention is for asset managers to be able to enable investors, retail and institutional, to match their values with value. The sales pitch is, look, we're going to invest in better companies that do a better job of managing their environmental, social footprint and have better governance. They will then generate better returns and you'll win twice. Your returns will be higher and the world will be a better place. And it's a compelling narrative. It's been fueled by academic research over the last 10 years. It has been a massive shift in attitude from these kind of things that used to be called CSR. It used to be that people thought that would cost a company. Now people believe it'll benefit a company. And as a result, there's been a sea change, such that now, according to Bloomberg, $1 in every $3 is invested in some form of ESG vehicle, which is over $30 trillion. You think, wow, that sounds awesome. Were it only true. The problem is there's no regulation, at least in the US, of what constitutes an ESG fund. And so I can put together a basket of stocks that I already am marketing and just call it an ESG fund. I'm allowed to do that. And over 500 funds have been rebranded in the last 12 months. No different in terms of their characteristics, just rebranded. Other funds have just been created out of thin air called ESG funds. I'll give you one example. The BlackRock, the largest asset manager in the world, they manage $1 of every $10 of the world. They created a fund called the U.S. Carbon Readiness Transition Fund on April 8th. They raised $1.25 billion in 8 hours, largest ETF they'd ever raised. And you think, that's awesome. You know, people are interested in U.S. carbon readiness transition, so I'll go look at the holdings. And they must own, Tesla and Ørsted and battery manufacturers. And you go look and you're like, wait a minute, this must be a mistake. They own Tesla. They don't own Tesla. They own Facebook, they own Apple, they own Google, they own JP Morgan, they own Dover Industrials, which is a fuel pump manufacturer, they own Chevron. It's the same as an S&P 500 fund. And so we're losing twice. We're thinking we're getting impact, planetary impact, when we're not. And we think we're getting alpha or market outperformance when we're just really buying the market for the most part. Now, there are exceptions on the tail of this, but for the most part, it's not delivering either impact or alpha.
So it sounds like there's loads of greenwashing. Maybe it's noticing the ESG through the trees is the trouble. But you said it's a really compelling narrative, so compelling that Larry Fink, the I'm not sure what role he is, but he's a senior executive at BlackRock, said that demand for ESG was going to transform all investing. So did ESG replace CSR, or is it a little bit more complicated than that?
So Larry Fink's the CEO and chairman of BlackRock. He's the one who built the firm.
Oh, I thought that was
It
Schwartzman.
is more complicated than Stephen Schwartzman is Blackstone.
Oh, forgive me. So there's a
Two
difference.
different firms.
Okay.
Yeah, they're both monsters. BlackRock is bigger, but so ESG hasn't replaced CSR. Just to complicate things, because there's lots of acronyms, CSR is what the corporate world calls the same thing that the investment world calls ESG. Okay, so if you were in a company, though the vernacular is changing, 10 years ago you issued a CSR report, a corporate social responsibility report. It detailed your carbon footprint, your water footprint, your diversity at the board level, your code of conduct in your factories, your factory audits, all that stuff. At the time, 10 years ago, investors really didn't care about it because, as I mentioned before, they viewed it as a negative. They viewed it as something which detracted from shareholder value. Well, roll the tape forward 10 years, and now we're in ostensibly a period when stakeholders have taken over from just shareholder. The Business Roundtable was just this kind of organization with 185 different US-based companies, changed their manifesto now to be less about shareholder only, the Milton Friedman view of the world, but now about stakeholders, meaning we care about employees and suppliers and the planet and shareholders and all together. And as a result of that change in zeitgeist, now investors are caring more about ESG, which is the corporate side was called CSR. So one hasn't replaced the other, one's really built on the other.
Okay, so thanks for making that qualification. Could you just then, in that case, introduce us to ESG? And forgive me if it's too simple of a question, but just before we go on, it'd be good to really hammer home the framework, the groundwork.
Okay, so ESG is not monolithic. It contains lots of different investing types. So you can find funds that are impact funds, meaning family offices that are wealthy, that are committed to delivering planetary impact as a first objective. They, for example, could invest in improving water access in Southern Africa. And they care less about a return. They care more about a planetary return. That's an impact fund. That could be a form of ESG investing. A second form could be what I call climate tech, which is early stage venture investing in new solutions. That could be ag tech, it could be vertical farming, it could be battery storage, it could be renewable energy, it could be hydrogen, it could be a lot of things. That's another type of ESG investing. Those are both small. Impact investing is about $1 trillion total. Climate tech is about $100 billion total. Professionally managed assets globally for round numbers are about $100 trillion. So we're talking about there, less than about 1% of the total. Most ESG investing is in one of two types, either negative screen funds or ESG integration funds. Negative screen funds, they have their history going back to apartheid in South Africa, where the church and others didn't want to be invested in companies that were doing business in a racist country. And so asset managers started screening out certain types of investments. It could be companies in South Africa, it could be nuclear weapons companies, it could be weapons manufacturers, it could be tobacco, it could be alcohol. Funds that exclude specific types of sin stocks are known as negative screen funds. That's the first or second biggest category of ESG investing, depending on the geography. The second biggest is ESG integration, which is really just asset managers looking at companies and trying to understand how changes in the planet are going to impact their P&L, their bottom line. So they may be concerned that if a company has a factory in an area that's particularly prone to hurricane, that's a concern. If a company has a factory in an area, if you're Coca-Cola and have bottling plants in southern India where there's drought, that's a concern, right? And so it's really, for me, just traditional investing, but taking account of new planetary risks, social and environmental. Those are the two biggest categories of ESG investing. Now, the first, negative screen. So let's say you have a traditional fund, but they decide they're not going to invest in weapons manufacturers. They're still investing in fossil fuel companies. They're still investing in traditional companies. I'm not sure how that's going to change the world. By the way, others will be buying the weapons manufacturers that they're not. So it doesn't do anything. The second one, ESG integration, companies just, investors just looking at companies to manage their risks. That's just traditional investing, in my view. I mean, investors should be concerned about companies' risks. So again, not going to do much of anything for planetary welfare. And so the fact that most people interpret ESG, environmental, social, and governance, as delivering planetary welfare is concerning to me for really three reasons. The first, which is the least important, is they come with higher fees than traditional funds, about 40% higher. So the asset managers, the BlackRocks, the Vanguards, the State Streets of the world are making billions, hundreds of billions of dollars because their fees are higher on these things. That's just a wealth transfer, and okay.
But do they justify that through like a high morality because these funds are helping the planet? That's why they cost more, or
No, they, just well, they remember, just like any consumable, if people want it more, you can charge more for it. And so, if there's higher demand, you can raise your prices for a denim manufacturer or an asset manager. And so they can get it, so they get it, which is a concern, but it's not my principal concern. The second concern is that investors think that they're doing something good for the planet when really, in fact, they're owning Google, and that is a concern as well. It's a not a huge concern, but it's a concern. My biggest concern is that it creates a certain laziness in policymakers, where they believe that the investment world, the world of money, is going to solve our social environmental problems, and they therefore will defer necessary policy or legislation that's required to address these challenges. That's my big concern.
I just wanted to qualify two things with you there. On the negative screen side of things, you said that if, for example, if you took the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, I suppose they famously a while ago decided to cut out all oil companies from their portfolio, which would be considered a sort of ESG motivated move. I don't know if they branded it as such, but nonetheless, you could put it in that category. Doesn't that then reduce demand for these companies so it does actually serve a purpose?
So I find that one dripping with irony, because the reason Norway has so much wealth is fossil fuel related. Now, the fact that they're going to turn around and not invest in fossil fuel companies, I find ironic. But let me respond to your specific question. Stocks are liquid, meaning if the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund isn't going to buy it, maybe the Dubai Wealth Fund will. Or, if assets become valuable or cheap, someone else is going to buy it. Could be a private equity firm, it could be someone else, but markets are pretty liquid. And so while I think there might be some tipping point where if, three-quarters of the world's investors said they weren't going to buy something, maybe then you'd see a difference in pricing. I don't think we're close to that really yet.
And there isn't an example that you know of where enough investors through an ESG morality lens have decided to negative screen out a certain company or industry that has actually affected its bottom line?
Well, it's hard to prove, but I can tell you right now, energy companies are doing exceptionally well with oil at $103 a barrel. And their profits are up, and so are their stock prices. It could be over time that insurance companies stop insuring certain types of fossil fuel companies, which could result in some kind of tipping point. And there's a beginning of a movement to that end, where certain insurance companies are now refusing to insure certain assets. But I'd be hard pressed to point to a specific case. There might be cases where the cost of capital has gone up for certain kind of sin-related activities, but I don't think it's putting anyone out of business.
To also just make one more final comment on the negative screen component. Obviously, what's happening in Russia right now is due to sanctions, legislative reasons why people might not be able to, buy Russian stocks or whatever. But if you could speak about that moment now, it's not necessarily ESG, it's for a different motivation, but would that go in the negative screen basket if, say, for example, a bunch of wealth funds around the world decided we're not going to buy Russian stocks because we don't like what they're doing?
Yeah, I do think it would be go under that ESG umbrella. I again find this one a bit ironic. Russia's been an authoritarian dictatorship for some time now. And yes, it's true that what's going on in the Ukraine is a particular horror, but it's not to say that the human rights record of Russia has been great historically, and yet lots of folks have invested in it. Um, but now the screen that's being applied because of what's going on in Ukraine is more rigorous, not just legislatively, not just in terms of sanctions, but morally. I mean, I think BP and Exxon have both in the last week pulled out of or committed to pull out of massive investments in fossil fuels in Russia, for example.
Yeah, I saw Peter Zeihan tweet about this just before we started recording, saying that exactly that BP and Shell, decade-year-long investments, they're deciding to pull the plug before having a cent return. That's, I suppose, a moral win, right? The bottom line didn't dictate exactly, the shareholder value didn't dictate the exact actions there. What about
I think that's fair.
Yeah. Well, sorry, it sounds like there's a bit of a delay between us in case we talk over each other. Yes, the second half, the integrated part of ESG, you gave the example of, say, you might price in that there are droughts in a particular part of your supply chain, therefore X, Y, and Z response. Isn't this something that we've always done? Why is that all of a sudden branded as ESG? Because it's just good business to, project 20 years into the future and be like, actually there's a bit of political instability in this country. We best not, build there, or environmental instability, so forth. Does that question make sense?
Absolutely. It has been done. It's just that the planetary challenges are now much more acute than they were 30 years ago. So when I graduated from business school, no one uttered the word climate change. Resources were unbounded and unlimited. Supply chains were close to home. They weren't far, far away. But roll the tape forward 30 years, and we've had a period of neoliberal dominance and deregulation and supply chain dispersion and addition of complexity and code of conduct issues in far, far away places that don't have the same environmental or social laws as we do here. So you've got a whole series of social issues that didn't exist. And environmentally, well, we're bumping up against natural limits. We have passed planetary boundaries in many cases, and these challenges are accelerating. So whereas we hear sometimes anecdotal stories that are comforting and good about either companies or countries or industries, in general, the trend is that the improvement against the environmental concerns is going more slowly than the rate of destruction. And so the gap's getting bigger. And so more and more companies now do have to think about planetary impacts that didn't have to think about it in years past.
Just to round off the ESG point, can you open up on why you said this a little bit further? Because throughout all your answers, you have already been hinting at it, but just one final nail in the coffin. Trillions of dollars are now invested in light green ESG funds, and there is little evidence that they will deliver planetary impact or the promised higher returns. So what harm will this do long term? Is it just a huge misallocation of capital and a missed opportunity, or are there sort of deeper harms?
Well, I mentioned this prior, but the harms I thought are threefold. One is the transfer of wealth because of higher fees. Two is the fact that individuals think they're getting something they're not. And three is the one I'm most concerned about, which is that we've been through a period now of 25 years of ascendancy of corporate voluntary action. Okay, so if you go back 25 years ago, that was the creation of the GRI. The Global Reporting Initiative was created in 1997. It was in response in part to the Exxon Valdez disaster, I think. And it was spun out of Ceres, which is a great NGO in Boston. And that was intended to set up a routine and standards for non-financial measurement, or measurement of what I called before CSR. And since we've had lots of other acronyms come into play, SASB's, the Sustainable Accounting Standards Boards, IIRC, et cetera, all these different bodies that are trying to help provide guidance for measurement of non-financial impacts. We've also had companies voluntarily, like Timberland, where I worked in Patagonia, saying they're going to clean their acts up on their own. We've had then a third generation of voluntary action in the form of what was called CSV, its own acronym, or Creating Shared Value, which was pushed by Harvard Business School, saying that companies could save the planet and find profit. The fourth generation is what I think is ESG investing, and the fifth is we haven't talked about yet, but it's called impact accounting, and it's what's coming next. Each of these ideas is premised on the notion that companies, for their own best interest, will clean up and will drive improvements in planetary welfare. And yet we're 25 years in and carbon emissions are 50% higher than they were when this whole dance started. And that's just one measure. And so I think we should have by now enough evidence that says the system incentives and system structure are the problem, and that we can't hope that companies on their own are with the rules that they're operating under are going to be able to, save the day when it comes to planetary welfare. And that's my concern.
And so does that then, it sounds a little bit like this fifth generation impact accounting might include a much more sharp legislative sword. Is that what you're thinking? Since the company itself might not be able to sort of regulate it?
I wish. No, I wish. That fifth chapter is the fifth chapter in the corporate voluntary action narrative. And so it doesn't include a regulatory impetus. It is there's a number of groups. Impact Weighted Accounts Group is one at Harvard. In Europe, there's one called the Value Balancing Alliance. There's the Natural Capital Coalition. The EU is looking into this. It's a new push supported by the accounting firms globally that says, hey, the reason that companies haven't addressed these planetary challenges is because they come in lots of crazy measurements. So carbon emissions comes in metric tons, and water usage comes in liters, and code of conduct violations comes in incidents, and workplace accidents comes in incidents. And so executives don't know what to do with this, nor do investors. If we could just dollarize everything and sum it all up into one number, it would be easier for managers. We'd be putting it in their language, and they'd be better able to deal with this. And again, it's a very attractive idea because now some of these bodies are coming back and saying, hey, look, we've got a company like JetBlue, and it gets credit for its positive externalities, like it's the wages it pays people and the taxes paid and the community donations it makes. And let's add that to their standard earnings. So let's say they earn $10 and they got $3 of credit for their positive externalities. But now let's subtract out, dollarized, their negative externalities. And they're big emitters of carbon. And so we're going to calculate their carbon and we're going to price carbon at $100 a metric ton. And we're going to find out we're going to have to subtract $5 more. And so now they're down to $8. Okay, so we now know the impact accounting of JetBlue, and we can compare it to American Airlines, and we can compare it to General Mills, and we can compare it to Boeing. And isn't that cool? And I wrote an article with a colleague named Andy King that was published in Stanford's Social Innovation Review that's caused a great deal of debate, called Heroic Accounting. And it warns that this is a really bad idea that sounds attractive on the surface, but has a lot of challenge. I'm saying that is to me the fifth chapter, which is now developing, that's not yet broadly understood in the work of corporate voluntary action to save the planet. There is going to be an article in the Wall Street Journal about this in the next couple of weeks that presents both sides of the argument. I'm presenting one, but the proponents would present another.
Look, it does sound like a fantastic solution, but isn't the sort of problem just in our inability to account for all of that complexity and actually be able to dollarize all these different externalities that are in their own rights impossible to calculate? If you look at the
I'm sorry, you hit on one of the big problems. There's probably 4 or 5 big problems with the idea of impact accounting. The first you're mentioning is complexity. Well, if you go and read the work papers of the groups that are doing this work, credit to them for publishing them, you realize that you have to extrapolate, interpolate, estimate, and make subjective assessments in order to get to measures. So, for example, they have a working paper out on the consumer packaged food industry, looking at companies like General Mills, et cetera, and trying to make judgments about their positive and negative externalities and how to price them. So they have a section on, okay, how do we charge them negatively for trans fats? I mean, you have to get down to that level. And so they give them a benefit for solving for world hunger if their prices are low. They penalize them for not solving world hunger if their prices are high. They have to figure out what the cost is of heart disease. They have to figure out, versus an average product line, how many trans fats is acceptable. All these judgments are going into coming up with a number. Now, the number itself sounds elegant, but if you go look at all the assumptions behind it, it's insane. It can't be done. That's number one. Number two is an even bigger problem is that sustainability or pricing of externalities is a system construct by definition, meaning the same impact in a different place should be priced differently. So think about it this way, very simply. There's a problem with a red fox in Australia, which is destructive to the ecosystem, whereas the same red fox, literally, in North America is considered a benefit to the ecosystem. And so how are we going to price the impact of the red fox? It depends on where the red fox is living. So number one, it's complex. Number two, it's a system construct. Number three, which I think is almost maybe more importantly, is that if investors continue to make investment decisions based on a company's traditional P&L, if you show them a different P&L, do you think they're going to care? And do you think managers are going to behave differently if their incentives are still based on a traditional P&L? I mean, it'll be nice information to have, but I'm not sure it changes much.
Yeah. I mean, it just sounds like, to hammer home the complex point, almost just a heroic task, almost a godlike impossible task to take into account all the variables to get an accurate pricing measure. And the second that you have skepticism, people's faith in it just would collapse on itself. And I just see that as being like a crazy hurdle. Yes. So
well, let me just mention to you also. You talked about how complicated it is. PwC, the accounting firm, has just announced they're hiring 100,000 new accountants, and many of them are going to be focused on this very work. So if you wonder who likes this idea, right? Consultancies, accountancies, etc., think this is important.
And they also see it as a great way to affect the bottom line on a 50-year horizon.
Absolutely, 100,000 is a lot of people.
Yeah, on this topic as well, there's a company here in Sweden, I won't name them just in case, but they are a sort of SaaS product, and they calculate companies' carbon footprints. And I was speaking with a guy who's hanging out with him who is one of the first employees at the company, so he's been there for a long time. They're doing exceptionally well, Ken. You can imagine, all of the ESG hype. They went from 20 to 90 employees last year. They're doubling again this year. And he was sort of, telling me about it behind the scenes. It's not an accurate carbon footprint. It's their estimate, and there's no sort of regulatory body that is confirming that they have the right thing. Instead, all of these different private institutions try to help each other a little bit to decide, what is this input in the Indian supply chain worth, and it's a bit of a drop in the what do you call it, like finger in the air,
drop in the bucket.
In the bucket.
So you couldn't be more right. And so I think that we have a lot of environmental challenges. The one that's most, to me, existential is climate change, evidence the IPCC report that just came out this week. So after all these 25 years, you'd think we'd know how to measure and be able to measure this thing you're talking about, called your carbon footprint. Well, the organization that actually is the warehouse for all this reporting is an organization called CDP. It used to be called the Carbon Disclosure Project. It's now called CDP. They just released a report that said only 20% of the public companies, forget private companies, the public companies that report their carbon footprint to CDP give them a comprehensive, complete footprint. And without being too wonky, I'll tell you, there is a body that regulates how one measures. It's the greenhouse gas protocol, it's called, and it calls for measurement of 3 scopes of emissions. Scope 1 is your direct emissions, like you're driving to your office. Scope 2 is your purchased electricity, meaning you look at your electricity bill, you can find out the source of primary energy generation and calculate your carbon. Scope 3 is everything else. Scope 3 is 15 categories. It's all upstream and downstream emissions. Okay? The 20% I told you, the ones that measure Scope 3, the vast majority of companies in the world do not measure Scope 3 yet. And so I worked at Timberland, which was a wonderful, wonderful place that was genuinely values driven. And we presented publicly our carbon footprint to the world. We committed to reduce emissions by double digits while growing. And the last 7 years I was there, we reduced our carbon emissions by about 13% a year while the company grew, almost doubled in size. And you'd say, wow, that's pretty cool. I wish everyone did that. Unfortunately, if you look at the footnotes, it said that we reduced our Scope 1 and 2 emissions by that much. And our Scope 3 emissions, we couldn't figure out how to calculate. And I'm happy to explain to you why, but we couldn't figure that out at the time. Unfortunately, our Scope 1 and 2 emissions amounted to 4% of our total. So we were reducing the 4%, 13% a year, but on the 96%, we weren't sure. That is, unfortunately, today, still how most companies do it, Patagonia included. They don't release yet their Scope 3 emissions because they haven't been able to calculate it.
That is a cause for a lot of concern because it sort of reaffirms the skeptical part of your brain that says this is all marketing. All of this crap is just marketing. Because if Patagonia and Timberland, two companies that are sort of morally, ethically driven, give it a fucking good old go to try and calculate the emissions and they miss out on 96% of them, like what hope is there for any sort of accurate carbon footprint? So I was, just to continue on this anecdote with this guy, I said, well, you know, H&M, he was a salesman. So I was like, yeah, H&M would be a good client, wouldn't it? You know, we're here in Stockholm, you can probably reach out to them. They're going to want to say that they know their carbon footprint for every t-shirt that they sell. And he said, yeah, it would be, but it's just an impossible feat, literally an impossible feat because of this Scope 3. How are you supposed to take from the cotton? How much water was in it? What was the labor there? What was the transport to the factory? What was the labor there? What was the transport to the next place? X, Y, and Z. All of a sudden you have 10 million variables and no one gives you accurate data. It's just a mess the whole way down. I don't know. I think I'm starting to just like talk in circles, but this is the skepticism, I suppose, for ESG and climate reporting generally.
Right. And I think it ties back to what we've been talking about before, which is voluntarily, it's very hard for a company to commit to do this when their competitors aren't. And so it's not that it can't be done. It's just to say, when you're running a company, you're worried about a lot of things. You're worried about your product line, you're worried about your strategy, you're worried about your gross margins, you're worried about your sourcing base, you're worried about creating demand, you're worried about your personnel, you're worried so many things. And so now if you're going to tell me, okay, in addition, you're responsible for measuring 50,000 data points every 6 months that aren't currently measured in shared factories in faraway places. Go ahead, figure it out. Well, I promise you, we've sent a man to the moon. We can figure it out. The issue is, how much does it cost? And if other people don't do it too, should I figure it out? Does the system really want me to figure it out? Because I'm going to report lower profits than my competitors if I do, at least in the short term.
Yeah, totally. How can you justify a very, very expensive line of costs when it's not legislated and it's not exactly clear that the market's going to respond with, you know, a big round of applause? Anyway, before we move on to sustainable fashion, I want to bring up one more company bring one more to your attention, and it's Planet, this satellite company. Just to see, are you familiar with it?
No.
Oh, you'll love this company. So very, very mission driven. They have by far and away the most satellites in orbit. What they do is they take in imaging of the Earth every single day. And so you can imagine with that data set over time, the value, the absolute value. They're playing a huge role right now in the Ukraine because obviously they have, you know, military applications. But outside of defense and stuff, it is amazing for agricultural producers, amazing for insurers, hedge funds. You know, they have day on day pretty sharp imagery down to, I think, 3 meters by 3 meters on a pixel, so that you can see how many trucks are going in and out of a place. You can tell a lot of stuff. Anyway, I bring it up just because they have this whole idea of the truth economy, and it's their idea of how sort of capitalism and companies are going to go forward in the way that they think about their impact to the world. In all of their public promotion, I never hear them talk about ESG. They talk about this truth economy. But it's very interesting because it's this idea of how much of what data can do to change incentives. Because like we were just saying, carbon footprint is, it's pretty fucked because you can't accurately say, you can't confirm that you actually have the right number. But imagine if you could, all of a sudden legislation becomes far more feasible, far more credible. And all of a sudden you can actually, use the iron fist of the law to enforce some things because you can say, look, the data is actually accurate on this. We're not just, we're not just fighting in the wind here. There is hard data behind it. Anyway, that's a company I think you'll get a kick out of. Amazing company.
Well, it sounds amazing. I can tell you though, there are limitations to what they can do. There's great things they can do. Evidence they can, show us the tank column going, outside Kiev in real time. They can also tell you, I'm sure, how many cars are in the parking lot at Walmart today, tomorrow, and compare it to prior year. I mean, there's wonderful, they can do great stuff, but it's not clear to me how they would be able to tell me the greenhouse gas footprint for a shoe that's made in a factory with 17 other brands that has a supply chain that's 4 tiers deep that spans into the Amazon. I mean, there's certain problems that would be really hard. Maybe over time technology will solve them, but today I think it'd be hard for just a satellite company to give me all that data.
Yeah. And I wasn't suggesting that they would solve that particular problem, but it was more just the ethos that they carry, this notion of data being the real equalizer. And for them, they can cover a few things. It's apparently, I don't know the ins and outs of it, but apparently as well with different types of imaging, you can actually get more insights than just basic picture. Playing around with different types of infrared. I don't want to say too much. I really don't know. But very interesting. Let's transition to sustainable fashion. So you've already made, I think, very, 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 very sort of accurate commentary, or at least accurate, who might I say accurate, but I agree with you on the sort of hypocrisy of the Norwegian sovereign wealth fund, as well as investing in Russia. They didn't become a despotic nation the last week, but can you take us through some of the irony that is laden thick throughout sustainable fashion?
So to be clear, I'm glad the Norwegian sovereign wealth fund is no longer going to invest in fossil fuels, notwithstanding the irony. Yeah, sustainable fashion is in some ways not dissimilar from the ESG conversation we started with. I mean, what is the definition of sustainable? Let's start there. I mean, you can call something sustainable, you can call it green, you can call it eco, you can call it vegan. And once again, there's no regulatory body in most places that's going to stop you from doing it, which of course leads to skepticism from a consumer standpoint, number one. Number two is you've got a real problem with the model. If you're making carburetors for a vehicle, you have the ability year on year to improve your product in terms of functionality. Or if you're making a printer, you can print more pages with less ink. I mean, there's metrics you can use that demonstrate improved performance. Well, how are you going to improve the performance of a pair of socks or a blouse or a pair of jeans? The answer is, well, apart from outdoor apparel and outdoor footwear, or athletic footwear, you're pretty much not going to, right? So you have to create demand. You have to cause change to happen based on something else, and that's what's called fashion, right? Why is it that one season skinny jeans are in, and the next season bell bottoms are in? Well, it's because we have to get you to change your wardrobe, because that's how we sell stuff and that's how we make money. And so it's not about better, it's about different. That's the second problem. The industry's gotten really good, though, at figuring out different. It's gotten quicker, meaning it used to be when I started at Timberland in 1992, we had 2 seasons. Today, someone like an H&M will have 24 deliveries, maybe more, annually per year. A company like Shein which is a $10 billion company now that's manufacturing clothes in China and selling them direct to consumers. It's the number one downloaded fashion app in the United
What an
States. They're
amazing
selling,
company. Yeah.
$8 jeans and $12 halter tops. They introduce somewhere between 1,000 and 5,000 new products a day now on their site.
Wow. That's
Okay, so
amazing.
if you actually sum together supply chains that have gotten faster, notwithstanding their distance from home, with social media, with the internet, you've got a real brew to kind of stir the change cocktail and get people to buy more. And that's what fast fashion is. So we got those two inherent issues, kind of what's sustainable and how you stir kind of the cocktail to drive demand. But that's not all. Fast fashion is also premised not just on more, but cheaper. So, different than most industries, the real costs of apparel have gone down over time. And how's that happened? Well, it's happened because supply chains have gone global and labor costs are cheaper in Bangladesh than they are in Miami. But it's also because materials have become cheaper. And if you go back 20 years ago, natural materials, things like cotton and wool and silk, etc., were at par with synthetic materials globally, meaning as many garments were made from synthetics as were made from natural materials. Synthetics, just to be clear, are a cute name for fossil fuels, meaning things like nylon and lycra, etc. Go on YouTube and watch how do you make nylon. It's actually spinning oil and then extruding it through like a pasta machine, okay, to get
Wow.
thread.
That's
No,
amazing.
people don't know this. When you're buying a top from Lululemon or from Nike, it's oil. Okay, now oil has
Wow.
two problems. One is to extract the oil is energy consumptive. Number two is the manufacturing process is energy intensive. And number three is when you throw it away, it doesn't, decompose for hundreds of years. It's plastic. Okay, and so I mentioned that 20 years ago, synthetics and natural materials were on par. Well, over that period of time, when you roll to today, synthetics are now about 60% of the industry. They've grown at 20 times the rate of natural materials because they're really good to make apparel. They can add performance characteristics and they're cheap. And it's really hard to compete with them. And so you start to put these things together no definition, a business system that requires growth, the internet and influencers, and the ability to create stuff fast and cheap, and the growth of synthetics. And you've got a real problem where people are buying lots more stuff, their closets are getting bigger, they're keeping it for less time, they're throwing it away more frequently, and it's piling up in landfills, it's being incinerated, or it's being shipped to faraway places you don't see in Africa.
So much there, Ken, and I think some of the questions later will address them specifically, but what I'm most interested in is the sort of raw materials of it all. So, when you were the COO of Timberland, what hard truths were you exposed to in your supply chain? And you don't have to speak directly about your experience. You can speak generally about the industry, but I would just love to know, from sourcing cotton to different types of leather to the amount of water used, all the real dirty stuff that goes into creating clothing.
Well, I wish I had better stories to tell, and I'll tell you why I don't. It's because when I was at Timberland, this wasn't my passion or agenda. My passion was traditional. I loved the company, I loved the values of the company, and I wanted to make sure it grew, and I cared desperately about the people and the products, and that's what I focused on. We did have what was called a commerce and justice agenda at Timberland, and justice is a big word for business, and it wasn't my word; it was my boss's word. Give you a little bit of background. You can choose to keep or edit. But Timberland, by the time I got there, was in the third generation of family. Oh, sorry, I'm going to start that again. Timberland, by the time I got there, was in the second generation of family control. Okay, the company was a New York Stock Exchange traded company, but it had Class B shares with 10 to 1 voting rights. So the family, the Swartz family, controlled the company. Now, who are the Swartz family? Nathan Swartz was a Jew in Tsarist Russia who emigrated because of religious persecution with a fourth grade education and set up a shoe factory outside of Boston. And he sold cheap private label women's high heel shoes. He passed his company off to his two sons, Herman and Sidney. Okay, they didn't really get along. Herman was an accountant, Sidney was a manufacturing guy. Sidney went to college at University of Maine, a state school, gambled away his tuition money sophomore year, hitchhiked home, and his father gave him a broom. Okay, so whereas his father was fourth grade educated, Sidney made it through 1 year of college. In 1986, VF Corporation came to Timberland and said, "We'd love to buy your company. $60 million." And Herman, the accountant, did the math and said 60 divided by 2 is 30. I'm out. And Sidney said, "I got nothing else to do. I want to run the company." So the company went public via Merrill Lynch in 1986, raised capital to pay out Herman, and Sidney stayed. My first boss at Timberland was Sidney. Okay, and at the time I joined the company, it was probably about $160 million, $180 million company, publicly traded again, but didn't make much money, but growing very quickly. During my tenure there, Sidney retired, became executive chairman, and passed the company on to his son, Jeff, who's a contemporary of mine. And when Jeff became CEO, that's when I became COO. Jeff was a guy who was motivated by faith. And his interest in Timberland was the justice agenda. He really desperately cared about demonstrating that companies could be a force for social good. And the justice agenda had three components. It was civic engagement, it was global human rights, and it was environmental stewardship. And on every dimension, Timberland did leadership things and won award after award after award. Business Ethics, Forbes, Fortune, U.S. Presidential Award for Community Engagement called the Ron Brown Award. Timberland was really a pioneer in this kind of stuff, and it's all attributable to my boss, Jeff. I'm happy to share examples of things we did, but for example, Timberland was the first public company ever to give employees 40 hours of paid community service time. It was required. They had to take it. We didn't mandate what you had to do for service. We mandated that you had to do it. If you're interested in turtles in Destin, Florida, great, go save them. If you're interested in working at a AIDS clinic, terrific, go volunteer your time. We did actually also organize sponsored service events, but you didn't have to participate in those per se. That's one example. There were many, many more. But what I'm trying to say is that Jeff did a great job of leading that, and I was a participant, not a leader. I can tell you a story, though, that would characterize what some of the problems were in the supply chain. It actually occurred the year or two after I left, but it's instructive. It could have happened when I was there. Jeff one morning woke up to 65,000 emails in his inbox. And he was a guy who got up early and went through emails early, but that was a big number. And the more he looked through it, he thought, oh my God, these are all the same. And the more he looked, he found out they were all sent by the membership of Greenpeace, who had constructed an email warning Timberland that a fourth tier supplier in Brazil was cutting down the rainforest in order to feed his herd of cows. And that unless Timberland did something about it, there'd be an additional conversation. Now, Timberland, as I mentioned, was a company that was committed to this agenda, and yet we didn't know at the time that there was a fourth tier supplier who was cutting down the rainforest. We bought our products from third party tier one suppliers, mostly in Asia, who bought their leather from tanneries in Asia typically, who bought their hides from all over the world, who bought them in a wet blue state, who bought them from slaughterhouses, who bought them from people who were in the fields. And it was instructive for us because it warned us, oh my God, it's our responsibility to know this stuff, but it's not dissimilar for most companies. Very, very few companies understand all the nodes of their global supply chains. And so when you want to look beneath the cover, yes, you should know that, but it gets complicated in a world where supply chains are far, far away and really distributed and really complex.
So I love that anecdote because it sort of highlights that you would have had full due diligence over your particular customer in Asia, and you sort of would have hoped that they had their due diligence over their customers, but it's 3 or 4 layers removed. It's sort of, it can be passed off as an innocent mistake, but nonetheless it happens. It's like Nestle. I think maybe I said this in the previous, but sort of like Nestle, where they have maybe 1,000 small farmers in a few West African nations, and all the beans are collected and then washed at one facility. Yet if some really good investigative journalist figures out that one of those has child labor, all of a sudden your supply chain is full of child labor. So it's really tough. But could we then specifically, could you tell me about the environmental impact of, say, creating a cotton t-shirt, polyester nylons, and a pair of outdoor shoes, just so we can get a sense for what goes into creating our clothing?
Most of what goes into kind of outdoor clothing is synthetics. They have better performance characteristics. So if you're buying a jacket from Arc'teryx or from Rab or from Timberland, they're probably most likely some kind of nylon that wick moisture or are waterproof or are lightweight. And those are derived from fossil fuels, which is oil, and it is nasty to extract and process, and then doesn't biodegrade for hundreds of years. Um, Shoes are typically a combination of synthetics, so there's a lot of plastic in shoes. They also include woven materials like nylons. They include some natural materials, and they include oftentimes a lot of leather. In Timberland's case, a good deal of our environmental footprint was related to the fact that most of our shoes were leather-based. Um, and leather is a trickier one because it's a natural material, obviously. Um, and some people rail against leather, but leather's a byproduct. No one kills a cow for its leather. They kill a cow for its meat. And so you're going to have to do something with the hide anyway. The problem with leather environmentally is really in the tanning process. In places that are lightly regulated, often bad chemicals like chromium are used. And the effluent associated with that is really nasty and can get into drinking water and things like that. That's not the case with well-regulated jurisdictions and well-run tanneries, but it is the case in some places where those regulations don't exist, and so so certainly imperfect as well. But when you look at things like vegan leather, you hear a lot about, or mushroom-based leather, or all these kind of great bio-based materials, you have to be careful because most of those are actually bound together with synthetics, with plastics, and they don't tell you the whole story, and so it's not clear ultimately which is better. Here's where you get to This is where you get to a huge problem with footwear and apparel. It's a pretty straightforward business compared to like building a car. But if you as a consumer want to know what's better for the environment, a raspberry that's organic or one that's not, you have a shortcut called organic and somehow you believe it's better and it probably is. Now if I ask you, okay, which is better for the environment, that nylon t-shirt from Lululemon or an organic cotton t-shirt? The answer is it depends. And you think, come on, how can that be? The organic cotton t-shirt's better. And the answer is no. You have to go look at what's called an LCA or a life cycle analysis of the product. Nylon lasts longer than cotton. And the number one thing we have to think about is durability in terms of, disposability of product. Number two is cotton is a lot more water consumptive than nylon is. And so do we care here about emissions or do we care about water usage? And so the thread gauge is important. I mean, there's lots of different nuances around this. And so you'll find life cycle analyses from academics in different parts of the world that argue for cotton or argue for nylon, literally. And so how, again, is a consumer supposed to decide what to do? Because they're busy and have lives and have pocketbooks and have budgets and care about things like fashion and color and fit and price. It's too much to ask that consumers are actually going to save the day here. I mean, I think a lot of people say this because you read, oh, millennials, they care more about the environment. They're willing to pay more than 50% for a t-shirt than they are, a sustainable t-shirt than a conventional t-shirt. And then go look at behavior. It's the same people that are buying from Shein. Okay. And so, yes, I think ostensibly, in a non forced rank way, everyone would like to have something be more sustainable. But look at behavior, not survey data. And behavior says, I want a good looking t shirt that's cheap.
Yeah. Where's the skin in the game? How do you actually behave? That's probably the ultimate irony and hypocrisy out of all of it. Those that will signal most loudly about their cause for the environment will shop at Shein. But I'm trying to get a sense so we can know. And that's also the sourcing of the cotton, right? Famously in the Xinjiang province, maybe that cotton wasn't ethically sourced. In Australia, we used to be famous for this really good high quality organic cotton, but now recently there's been so much attention paid to the amount of water that goes to growing that cotton, and Australia is famously drought ridden. We've had our entire lives water restrictions. When I was growing up, we couldn't wash our car with a hose. We had to fill up a bucket and reuse the water and stuff. So anyway, there's all this sort of, again, complexity in the supply chain. But what I'm trying to get at is an understanding of, say, Zara, H&M, and Shein. They're producing millions of articles of clothing a year. We've made it very clear the unsustainability of fast fashion, why that's bad, because the garments quickly go out of they're low quality, etc. But I'm trying to get a sense for the environmental damage of actually creating this clothing. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. So at a macro level, the answer is, again, it depends. There are various studies that peg the carbon emissions of the fashion industry at 2% to 10% of global emissions. That's a big range. Global emissions, depending on how you count them, again, I call them, let's say, are 40 billion gigatons. And so 2 to 10% of that is fashion. Um, More concerning, or at least equally concerning, is it's growing quickly. And so, in order to get to a place that we're safe, below 1.5 degrees Celsius of global warming, emissions across the board have to fall by like 45% by the year 2030 and net zero by 2050. We are nowhere close to that trajectory in general, and nowhere close in fashion. And so, all of these aggregate organizations, the Fashion Pact, the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, Better Cotton, all these different industry initiatives are not moving the needle.
This was a very powerful comment from the article, which I really liked. Recycling bins in H&M and Zara stores are guilt-free placebo that encourages ever more consumption. Most donated items end up in landfills in poor countries. How can that be? If they advertise it as recyclable, how are they throwing it away?
Well, there's a difference between recyclable and recycled, first of all. Second of all, if you think about it, in the apparel business, less than 1% of all clothes are upcycled into new clothes. You think, whoa, how can that be? Well, when you actually, pull a garment apart to recycle it, the thread length actually degrades. It becomes shorter and they become less useful. And so, more often than not, jeans are shredded and used in things like mattresses or insulation. And by the way, that's less than 10% of overall apparel, okay, is actually upcycled in something else. It's too expensive, okay, and there's not the infrastructure today for companies to actually figure out how to upcycle in a way that's economic. Virgin fiber, virgin cotton, virgin synthetics are cheaper more often than not than upcycled. Now that changes in certain cases. With oil at $103 a barrel, it probably changes where recycled PET might be more economical for a period of time. But in general, there isn't the infrastructure, there aren't the incentives to make recycling work broadly. And so most companies are collecting this stuff, and some of it is recycled, and most of it goes to goodwill or savers, and then most of that ends up in faraway poor countries.
Give me an idea of tonnage. Let's say on an annual basis, if most of it is ending up in landfills, if we could somehow look at
I don't know the answer to this.
Can you ballpark maybe one country so we can get a feel for it? Maybe speculate as to how many cubic meters?
No,
Okay.
we can find out. We can look online together, and I can figure it out for you. But I don't know the answer.
Okay, no problem. We can let the audience do their own research there. But I mean, if Shein is producing 5,000 new articles a day, making available, H&M has 24 new styles per season. I mean,
deliveries per season, not styles.
So styles is even more than
deliveries. Oh,
really?
Maybe 30,000.
Oh fuck. Okay, I really don't know. I don't know what I'm talking about here, but
well, I can give you a number if you want a big number. People think
give us some shocking numbers from the industry.
There are like 100 billion garments manufactured per year.
Holy crap! See, that's way more than I thought it would be.
I've seen an estimate as low as 60 and a number as high as 100. I don't know what the real truth is. The problem is, look, if I'm giving you ranges like 2% of carbon emissions to 10%, and I'm giving you ranges from 60 billion to 100 billion garments, well, clearly no one knows, right?
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
Just a shit ton, and it's getting bigger.
I mean, even 60 billion is just absurd. That's assuming what percentage of the populace actually gets to go out and buy 100 new articles of clothing a year, Very
well, in developed countries, this is a problem. This is an environmental challenge. It's a justice issue across the world. It's the developed countries that are causing the problems. The problems manifest in poor countries.
Right. Yeah.
Period.
Yeah. I wonder as well in developing nations, say Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, Mexico, where maybe a lot of these garments might be manufactured, is there also the same hyperconsumption in these nations as well? Or do people sort of think differently about it?
No, they don't have the money. The average wage in Bangladesh is probably, oh God, what is it? Less than $1 an hour.
Okay.
I don't know the exact wage right now, but I mean, people they have money to live off of and buy food. They don't have money to buy, 14 pairs of shoes a year.
Is America the biggest consumers per capita fashion?
America's the biggest consumer per capita. I don't know specific to
Yeah, okay,
fashion,
okay.
but it's probably India is probably 1/10 per capita as U.S.
Yeah.
Just to give you a kind of round ballpark, Europe's probably, my guess is probably about half U.S. U.S. is bad. Um, in terms of overall consumption, China's the biggest, but per capita, it's the U.S.
Sure, yeah. China's got a couple more people they're working with over there. All right, look, Ken, because you leave absolutely no prisoners in your article of the myth of sustainable fashion, you even went after second-hand resellers. Now, surely these guys couldn't be also part of the problem. Could you, give your argument there?
I don't think they're bad per se. It's just they're not good enough, is what I would say. I mean, these new business models of resale and reuse and repair, they're all net good. But for example, a company in the US, Rent the Runway, was a big company for a long time, very successful, at least in terms of its publicity. It was, women's dresses that people would buy, they'd rent them instead of buy them. So if you wanted a Chanel gown or something very expensive, you'd pay 1/10 the purchase price, use it for a weekend, and send it back. And everyone thought, wow, that's cool. Clothes are getting recirculated. They're having a longer shelf life. That's going to, kind of clamp down on consumption. Well, consumption continues to go up, number one. And number two, even according to their figures, meaning Rent the Runway, the reduction of carbon associated with their business model is 3%, if you accept their figures. And that's because the logistics of sending something back, transporting it, dry cleaning it, hanging it, sending it back out, that is carbon consumptive as well. And so it's not a free lunch. Same thing with secondhand. Secondhand stores have existed for years. I mean, go to your local street corner and you can buy secondhand clothes. The fact that they're now sold online and there's more of it, that's terrific, but it's still a tiny percentage to total. So it's not the salvation.
Yeah. Two more questions. The first being, my girlfriend wanted to know, as a consumer, what should she look out for? She's a very conscious consumer. Hasn't been shopping at H&M for a while, but maybe I'm a little bit cynical and I still remind her that largely most of her closet is not good for the environment. So what can she look out for? What should a consumer look out for if they really want to make a balmy effort to buy good stuff?
So buy less. That's the best thing you could do. Buy less frequently, buy better stuff that lasts longer. And there are certain brands that are certainly trying harder than others. Brands like, Patagonia or Eileen Fisher or Cotopaxi or Allbirds or Kering. I mean, they're brands that are actually legitimately trying. They're leading in this front. And so they are better than others, but buy less is what I would say. Yeah, I mean, we focus most of our energies on what I would call parameters of the system, when what we really need is a paradigm change or a mind shift change if we want to make a profound impact. And that's hard. I mean, it happens. There are tipping points when Barack Obama ran for president in the United States, which doesn't seem so long ago, he was against gay marriage. Okay, in the U.S. now, a vast majority of people are pro-gay marriage, and almost, I don't know if it's every state. I'm assuming every state has laws that enable gay marriage. That's a pretty quick transition from a Democratic presidential candidate being against it because he had to be to get elected, to the most of the populace being in favor of pretty quickly. So you can have tipping points where things transition, but when it comes to consumption, we've got years of advertising and feeling good about ourselves that's linked to buying stuff.
Ultimately, it has to be, well, not has to be, but the quickest way for it to happen would be through some sort of regulatory measure, right? Like if Shein all of a sudden had to pay an environmental tax on X, Y, and Z, the whole economics of the business would change, which is, I mean, it's not necessarily the political worldview that I would align with, but if you're like looking at it realistically, how can you actually make a difference? The consumer again and again, with the knowledge of climate change, will still make decisions when it comes to the wallet that are, not good for the environment.
Yeah, I think we've had a history now, I mentioned the 25 years, of industry actually trying to put the problem and the solution on the consumer. It's happened famously in the plastics business, at least in this country, where the plastics industry were the group that lobbied behind recycling without providing the infrastructure. So they said essentially, look, if the consumers would only recycle, we could upcycle the plastic and we'd be okay. And at the same time, they're building chemical factories that make more and more and more plastic, right? And we don't have the infrastructure to recycle. When it comes to apparel, I'm involved with a group that's sponsoring a bill in the New York State legislature called the New York Fashion Act, which is the first such act in the United States, in any state, that would require companies with revenues greater than $100 million who sell in the state of New York, not that their revenue in New York is over 100, they are as a company over 100 who sell in New York, they would be responsible for a whole series of disclosures around their supply chain to include how much waste, what percentage of recycled material, how much water, how many chemicals, what their average wage paid is in their factories, the locations of their factories, all that information, which is great. But from my perspective, more importantly, they would also be required to sign up with an NGO called the Science Based Targets Initiative, which is a consortium of 5 NGOs that actually approves companies' carbon plans and says that they have to deliver results that are in keeping with a 1.5 degrees Celsius world, which means they have to cut their carbon emissions by about 4% a year. Their absolute emissions, not their intensity, not per unit, but overall absolute emissions, in order to sell in the state of New York. And if they don't, the penalty is 2% of their annual revenue. It's significant. Now, this bill hasn't been passed. It's in the legislative agenda, in the process of receiving amendments, et cetera, and there's a lot of lobbying for and against it, so I can't tell you it's going to pass. But why I think it's really impactful is that you don't need to do this on a national level in this country. States like California and Texas and New York are like national economies in terms of their scale. And so companies aren't going to want to have one supply chain for one state and one for another, right? They're going to have to come up with a supply chain that delivers for the harshest set of regulations and then let that flow through the rest of the states. And so that is an example, if it happens, of something that I think will lift the floor for all companies and force pre-competitive collaboration to solve these problems.
Amazing, Ken. That sounds like a silver lining. And well-timed as well. We've got only 5 minutes left. I'd like to finish off with 2 questions that I try to ask every guest. The first of which being, think about a country going into the future that you are particularly bullish on. What is a country that you are quite bullish on?
As you can see, I'm not the bullish type, right? I'm the glass half empty. My boss was the glass half full. But I'm bullish on Israel. I'm bullish on the United States. I'm bullish on many countries in the EU. So I guess that's a whole bunch.
Cool. That is a whole bunch. There isn't one specific that stands out for a special reason?
Well, I spent a year living in Israel, and so I was just blown away by the ingenuity and collective spirit that exists there that was different from the U.S. U.S. is very me-focused, and Israel was very we-focused. Yeah. And that was really inspiring to me.
Yeah, I hear that a lot from people that have lived in Israel for a while. I'd love to go there. But it makes sense, right? I mean, their culture is very, very unified. There are very few things that they don't agree on.
Well, you have the history of the kibbutz movement and kind of socialist vibe, and then you also have this constant, intense pressure that's existential. And so it
Exactly.
requires
Yeah, they got
collaboration.
no friends around them.
You got the ocean, that's it.
Yeah. Okay, and finally, this is my favorite question. I'm not sure if you listen to many podcasts, but I'm sure you've listened to many interviews in your life. If there were two people that you could witness a conversation between, dead or alive, no language barrier, who would it be and why?
So I had the good fortune of um, getting to know someone who became a kind of hero of mine, a guy named John Lewis, who was an active participant early days in the civil rights movement. He became a congressman from the state of Georgia. He just died, a little more than a year ago. And because of Jeff, my old boss at Timberland, he became friends with John Lewis, and John Lewis started to come to Timberland sales meetings. And because of our service ethic, we named our kind of highest award that went to an employee year the John Lewis Award. And I got to meet him over time and learn from him. And he advocated something called good trouble, which was, get in the way, try to inspire people to be better. And that's what inspires me. And so I would love to hear a conversation with him with Martin Luther King, who obviously I
A
didn't
lot
get
of
to
good
meet.
trouble there.
Right, but he was a disciple of Martin Luther King's. And so to hear the two of them, yeah, they marched together in Selma. I mean, you see pictures of the two of them together. John Lewis wrote a book that's amazing that I recommend, that I have a signed copy of. I forget the title, something with the wind, that's unbelievable about, you want to learn about inspiration and overcoming obstacles and maintaining a affirmative spirit. I can't think of anyone in the world that I'd rather hang out with.
Beautiful answer, mate. Really appreciate it. Absolutely loved that. An education across the board. Cheers.
Thank you for having me.
Cheers, Ken. That was an absolute blast for me to record. I learned loads, and in retrospect, felt a bit silly for my confusion between ESG and CSR. But wanted to hear from Ken some of these hard truths about fast fashion, the business of clothing, and the irony that is just laden throughout. I would encourage everyone to read what Ken has written on this topic and more, which you'll find through Google search of him, or at least by his Twitter, which is going to be linked into the description of this show. One of the worst things you can do for the environment is to fill your wardrobe to the brim. Yet, the very same voices, the ones who I see walking around Stockholm every day, who are the loudest about the evils of diesel car owners, and those of us who still take planes, they are the very ones who fill most of their free time with online shopping and weekend trips to the mall. Buying clothes is one of the worst things you can do to the environment. So I think that's ultimately the takeaway. It's not all bad, but it's much worse than the sort of rosy view. There is such a hypocrisy to companies like H&M and Zara, who might gear all of their marketing towards a sustainable future, yet themselves produce millions and millions of articles of clothing per year that won't be recycled, and even if they were recycled, wouldn't be done honestly. So yeah, there's a lot in there. But yeah, cheers, Ken. Really appreciate it. On to whatever my ambition is for this podcast. So my hope is, and forgive me if you're hearing this for the 100th time, dear listener, but it's to corner the podcast market for eclectic curiosities in whatever country it is you're listening in from. So that's not defined. There is no defined eclectic curiosities niche or genre. That's what I hope to corner, essentially. So really, the only way I can see that eventuation coming into fruition would be to give reviews. So the only way I can really see that happening is through reviews. Nice, healthy, thick, juicy reviews from you, my dear listener. So yourself, your mates, your colleagues, really anyone who has a phone. I would encourage you to ask them to leave a nice 5-star review, say some nice words, in whatever the podcast algorithm is, whether it's Apple, Spotify, or one of the 20 others. So that's all from me this week. Cheers.